Welcome to the final session in our Straight Talk series, Voting in America. During tonight's program, we invite you to participate by submitting your questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Towards the end of the program, Furman students, CASSIDI, DOZIER, and BRITNEY PLUMLEY will ask our speakers a few of your submitted questions. Also, Furman students who are seeking CLP credit, please be sure to participate in any polls later in the program. Now, please hear these words of welcome from President Elizabeth Davis.
Good evening. I'm Elizabeth Davis, President of Furman University, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our final session of Voting in America, presented by Furman University's Richard W. Riley Institute and Osher Lifelong Learning Institute in partnership with South Carolina ETV. Over the past 2 weeks, we've looked at the history of voting and voting rights in America and the ongoing challenges we face in making voting fair and accessible for all United States citizens. Tonight we move to a discussion of safeguarding the security of our upcoming election and future elections. We are just 7 weeks away from this year's presidential election, and polling by Reuters tells us that one thing Republicans and Democrats agree on is that they have significant doubts about America's ability to hold a fair election this November. Challenges abound, some driven by external forces and others by our own politicians. Due to the coronavirus, election officials face a complicated process of administering and securing the 2020 election. The increase in mail-in voting and shortage of poll workers will strain the system in many states. Rhetoric from politicians on both sides of the aisle contributes to concerns among voters about the integrity of the election. Disinformation campaigns from foreign adversaries sow discord and feed chaos. What do we know about our system's vulnerabilities? Who can we trust to provide accurate election information? And what must we do to ensure the security of this year's election and beyond? We have 4 experts here tonight to talk about these questions and more. To moderate this discussion, I am delighted to introduce our own Teresa Cosby, Associate Professor of Politics and International Affairs, specializing in constitutional law and racial and ethnic politics. She'll lead what is sure to be an engaging, insightful, and rich discussion. Professor Cosby, take us away.
Thank you, President Davis. Good evening, everyone. It is my pleasure to moderate tonight's discussion. Constitution Day occurs on September 17th of each year, and Furman is celebrating it today with this program. In preparation for tonight's discussion, reread the questions you submitted when you registered, and they form the basis of the discussion you're going to hear tonight. Our first speaker is President of Indiana University, Dr. Michael McRobbie. Not only does President McRobbie lead a university system with over 111,000 degree-seeking students, he also co-chaired the Committee on the Future of Voting of the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. The committee authored the 2018 consensus report, Securing the Vote, Protecting American Democracy. This report offers us a detailed and accurate look at our election infrastructure. Tonight, we begin our discussion by working toward a shared understanding of how our system of elections operate in America. President McRobbie, please tell our viewers what the Committee on the Future of Voting found regarding the quality of our election infrastructure and the challenges we face in holding safe, free, and fair elections.
Well, thank you very much, Teresa. I'm delighted to be here and delighted to be able to participate in this panel. Let me just say just a couple of words about the National Academies Committee. This committee was put together soon after the 2016 election, partly in response to certain concerns about the integrity of elections. We then met for the next 18 months and produced our report, Securing the Vote, Protecting American Democracy, which is the title of the report. The report itself, the committee had 14 members, computer scientists, lawyers, social scientists, and election officials. It was co-chaired by myself and the president of Columbia University. 41 recommendations and a 150-page report based on testimony and input from over 100 people. But basically, we can boil it down to 5 areas. Firstly, it is essential that all elections be conducted with paper, with human readable paper ballots. Not something we expected when we started the process 2017, but where we unanimously ended up. It was essential to have a record of votes that could then be revisited when it came to recounts. We adamantly said that voting machines that were that only recorded a vote and had no paper trail should be removed from service as quickly as possible. And many states have done that. It's not yet completely done, but that has happened in a number of states. Secondly, we advocated for, or recommended, the use of a type of post-election auditing called risk limiting audits, RLAs. And a risk limiting audit basically takes a sample of the votes, a random sample of the votes that are cast, and before the results are certified, we'll check up to a certain level of probability the accuracy of the result of that election. The idea is basically very simple. The math behind it is quite complicated, but it is a way of doing a completely independent check of the validity of a result. Thirdly, we very strongly recommended against using the internet for any type of voting for the return of marked ballots in particular, given that we did not believe there was, at least at the moment, any secure, safe way of doing that that wasn't amenable to being hacked in some way. Fourthly, we stress the vital importance, and I think this is going to be even more true in this election, the vital importance of the integrity of the voter registration databases. That their security had to be paramount for election officials. You needed to ensure there were backups, maybe even paper backups of the registration database, and that any compromises, any issues at all concerning them be immediately reported to the Department of Homeland Security or other appropriate agencies. And finally, of course, fifthly, we stressed the importance of greater funding for the federal government to go to the states to modernize their election infrastructure. What we found in this report was the quality of that infrastructure varies enormously across states. Some have done a very good job, some haven't. But the only way that something approaching a more uniform election infrastructure is going to be achieved is going to be by and through federal investment. So that's a summary of the whole report, the key parts of that report.
Thank you. That's a great summary. And so now we're looking at an election that's complicated by COVID-19. What will be the biggest stressors on a system that is holding elections during a pandemic?
Well, I think clearly one of the stresses is obviously going to be concerning mail-in ballots to ensure that they arrive in time and that they are counted expeditiously. Though we described certain concerns about mail-in ballots, we had ultimately no concerns about the integrity of a process for mail-in ballots, whether they be for absentee or other reasons as well. So that's given that it will be used well beyond how it's been used in the past, is going to be a stressor. Secondly, is just going to be the effect of the pandemic on the polling booths themselves. They will have to be established in a way that ensures social distancing and appropriate hygiene measures. That's something that's never had to be done before. That's going to take effort. And then I think, as President Davis said before, there's going to be the issue of polling workers. Recruiting enough in these circumstances is also not going to be easy. And then finally, of course, the general issues of the cybersecurity issues concerning things like the registration database and so on. Having states be in a position to be able to handle that well and competently is clearly going to vary from state to state. So that is going to be a considerable stressor as well.
So are you concerned that the system could be overwhelmed by mail-in voting?
Well, I think that is a possibility that in some states that this is going to be beyond the ability of the resources to handle it quickly and expeditiously. So that clearly is going to be a stressor. But on the other hand, election officials who are extraordinarily dedicated people, as we discovered in our committee's report, and really have devoted their whole careers in many cases to understanding these processes. They've been aware of this possibility for months, if not years, and are obviously preparing for it. So I've got a certain amount of confidence that many states and many election officials will be on top of this and should be able to handle it.
So are you concerned about fraud?
Well, the studies have shown that are quoted on a regular basis that the rate of fraud with mail-in ballots is very, very small, and claims that it is susceptible to fraud. I think it's important for those who make those claims to provide the evidence for this. But again, there's something we studied in our report. There's a section of the report that describes this, and certainly we were not aware of any significant evidence, though there are issues that do need to be thought through and addressed when it comes to mail-in voting.
Thank you. So I want to bring David Levine into the discussion now. Are we ready for David?
I can see him.
You can see him? Okay, I can't see him. So David, as an elections integrity fellow at the Alliance for Securing Democracy, you look for vulnerabilities in democracies around the world. But before that, you have played a role in election administration in the states of Idaho and Virginia, and then in the District of Columbia. From the vantage point of someone who has worked on the ground with election administration, what would you add to what Dr. McRobbie has said about what voters can expect while voting in a pandemic? For instance, who they can trust.
Professor Cosby, can you hear me okay?
I can hear you and see you.
Perfect. No, I think that's a great question. And I think, a couple things are worth noting, right? One, I think it was really important to start at the open with the fact that, right, that there are segments of the American populace that seemingly have concerns about confidence with our election process. And I think one of the things that needs to occur through tonight's session, as well as subsequent to this, is that folks' ideas about our elections process need to line up with efforts that have been made to secure our elections since 2016. I would be encouraging folks to be reaching out to their state and local election officials as examples of trusted sources who can walk them through some of the steps that have been taken to try and ensure that our elections are as resilient as they can be, or certainly more resilient, right, since the 2016 presidential election. And, I think some of the things as a former election official that some of my colleagues now still in the field would talk about are the following, right? To the National Academy of Sciences report, and even after that, we see an increased number of jurisdictions that have paper-based voting systems, including in the state of South Carolina. We see an increasing number of jurisdictions that are doing post-election audits and conducting those audits before the results are certified. And to a point that President McRobbie raised, that's really important because that means there's an opportunity being taken to verify the results, at least a portion of them, which can, among other things, ensure one, right, that those results are accurate, and two, that there aren't any nefarious actions that may have occurred that might have tinkered with those results in one way or another. And three, we've seen jurisdictions, right, both locals and state election officials that have taken a number of measures to improve their chain of custody protocols. And when I say that, I mean taking measures so that there is a greater sense of where the voting equipment, for example, has been, where it's going to, and how it's getting back to the election office so that the results can subsequently be sent out on election night. I think it's really important in these times, right, when we see actors, like at our organization, right, we've studied foreign adversaries such as Russia, Iran, and China, right, and look at their efforts, right, to sow confusion and chaos, right, as they look to either push their own narratives or possibly amplify disinformation coming from within. I think it's really important that we are turning to trusted sources of information, whether it's state and local election officials or my fellow panelists, right, to be able to ensure that they have the latest and greatest as to what's going on with our elections.
So I want to give you credit for this because I knew that the Senate in South Carolina had approved no excuse absentee voting. And you let me know, like at the 11th hour, right before this program started, that the House has also approved no excuse absentee voting. So we're waiting on the signature of the governor. This audience would like to know, should South Carolinians trust that their ballot would be counted if they choose to vote by mail?
So the short answer to that is yes. And to touch on something that President McRobbie touched on, which I think is as true when the National Academy of Sciences put out their report as it is today, right? The security of voting by mail is still and remains strong, right? And that has been reaffirmed even as recently by the Cybersecurity and Security Infrastructure Agency, which is part of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, right? As the National Academy of Sciences has laid out, right, the implementation of that process, right, is an important piece of discussion, and we'll see how much we get into that this evening, right? There are different steps in terms of, right, ensuring you're registered to vote, making a request, right, to vote absentee, getting that request in, getting it processed, getting the ballot, and then being able to return it. But the process itself is secure, and for those South Carolinians that want to take advantage of that process, which appears to be more of them, or looks to appear to be more of them, right? I encourage them to do so. You know, it's really hard to determine from all that we have seen this year, right, how things will ultimately play out. I think we saw when COVID-19 first came, I think there was a lot about trying to ensure that vote by mail was an option for as many voters as possible. You know, more recently, I think we've seen some efforts and some reports out about, you know, the fact that voting safely can and should be done. You know, I think what's really important is that voters understand options. And if that House bill is ultimately signed by the governor, right, that, like with the June primary, would enable any South Carolinian, if they make that request, to be able to vote the ballot. I will just add two quick things about that House bill. Number one, it does keep in place that signature requirement. Right, that requirement was invalidated by a judge for the primary, but that hasn't yet happened here. And number two, of course, the House did not call for additional drop boxes, right? Boxes in which voters could return ballots. And so that's just something to keep in mind. But you know, it's worth acknowledging again, to your point, Professor, that this appears to be and hopefully will be an option, because having options to vote ahead of Election Day isn't just good for public health, and it's not just good for election administration officials, as the state election director, Ms. Andino, pointed out. It's also good for election security, right? If there are issues that are discovered well in advance of the election, there's a better opportunity to fix them as we get closer to Election Day.
Okay. So we're running a little tight on timing. So I want to very quickly ask both of you about concerns about foreign interference in our elections.
Well, if you look at our National Academy's report, the first sentence of the report noted that was the unanimous finding of the intelligence agencies about the 2016 election, that there was efforts to influence and interfere in various ways. I think that was established by the intelligence agencies, and then there have been similar reports in recent months coming from the same agency. So I think that really there's no doubt that those activities and actions are actually going on.
And I'll just add to Professor McRobbie's point, which is spot on, right? We at the Alliance for Securing Democracy look at, right, foreign interference. And, you know, just at the early part of this month, we saw the Department of Homeland Security put out an intelligence bulletin, right? And that bulletin reaffirmed, right, Russian efforts to try and interfere, right, in the election machinery, as well as their efforts to try and utilize, right, or exploit changes in voting processes, as well as the vote by mail process, to sow chaos and confusion and undermine confidence in our democracy. It's something that folks need to be vigilant about. It's something that folks need to be aware about. But folks should be confident that if they rely on their state and local election officials, they reach out to trusted sources, and they make a plan in advance, that they should be able to cast their ballot safely and securely.
All right, thank you. Thank both of you. So I'd like to move now to a discussion of how realities we face intersect with public perception. We know people don't read things like the report for the Committee on the Future of Voting. Instead, they hear sound bites on cable news shows, misleading or false information on social media, or talk news. Audience, we'd like to hear what you think about the integrity of the upcoming election. There is a poll that has appeared on the screen, and the poll is asking you, how confident are you in the process and in your vote getting counted? While you're doing that poll, I'd like to now introduce to you Robert COSTA. He is joining us now. Robert COSTA is the managing editor of PBS's Washington Week and national reporter for the Washington Post. Robert, you heard Dr. McRobbie and David talk about the concerns that exist among practitioners and academics regarding the security of our elections. When you talk to politicians, talk radio personalities, social media heads, and traditional media, what concerns do they express to you?
We are just 49 days away from the presidential election. And as a reporter covering this at the Washington Post, at PBS, on MSNBC, dealing with election integrity is something we're navigating in real time, and our sources are navigating in real time. I'll give you a quick example. Earlier today, I had a long interview with Senator Marco Rubio of Florida, a Republican, and he has an important perch in this entire discussion because he's the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee. And I asked him about Facebook and social media companies, about what's their responsibility in terms of regulating what kind of information or disinformation is allowed on their platform. And he said he's not really sure at this point about whether they should be more regulated. He's hoping that they continue to take action against disinformation. And you look at what Facebook has done in recent weeks, they have taken some steps. They've removed different accounts, pseudo news organizations that were really platforms for Russian operatives. They've removed some of these accounts from Facebook. But Senator Rubio is someone who's a Republican, conservative, and he's not really looking at this point to regulate Facebook and other social media companies like a utility company, like an electric company. But that's something we're hearing about from some Democrats as we move into the future because of frustration from what happened in 2016 and frustration once again. And talking to Senator Rubio and sources inside the Biden campaign and the Trump campaign, what I'm really finding is that active disinformation is happening from Russia. It's serious on social media. It's serious about sowing doubt in the election. It's also happening from China and Iran. Those are kind of the three that are always discussed. And for many of these campaigns, but also for us reporters, it's a challenge because decades ago, elections and politics was often discussed through the prism of news outlets, mainstream news outlets like my own, sometimes liberal, sometimes conservative news outlets. But now many Americans, millions of Americans, are often living their entire political existence online. And the gatekeepers in terms of fact checking, in terms of making sure foreign interference isn't happening, just isn't there. And so what I'm trying to do as a reporter is make sure my reporting has integrity. So when people access news and information from the Washington Post or PBS, it has a reputation of integrity and trust. And it's being eroded at different times from critics. But all we can do at this point is do our best because there's no real law at this point in terms of regulating information online.
So from your perch, what is your understanding of the different perspectives between Republicans and Democrats about mail-in voting?
Well, let's first start with the evidence that we've reported on at the Washington Post. there is no evidence based on my own reporting in the Washington Post of widespread voter fraud. That being said, many Republicans do believe there is widespread voter fraud. So we begin this conversation by having a disconnect between how people see the issue and the facts of the issue. For example, I interviewed a major Republican leader the other day, Steve Scalise. He's the number 2 Republican in the House of Representatives from Louisiana. He's the minority whip. And I said to him, sir, there is no widespread evidence of voter fraud and with regard to mail-in voting. And then he started to bring up anecdotal evidence about different instances of fraud. And I'm not here to say there have not been anecdotal instances of fraud, but there's not widespread fraud. And that's an important fact to start off with, because the integrity of mail-in voting nationally in many states with Republican governors, Republican office holders, has been a positive experience, people with absentee ballots and with mail-in ballots. But you have the President of the United States, Donald Trump, at this moment, continuing to say that mail-in voting will lead to fraud. And because of what's happening online, on social media, that voice from the president is having a real influence. And so the debate is not often being held on the same ground. I'm not here with a solution, but I do know that I'm also navigating a thicket when it comes to mail-in voting, because when I engage with voters, they have their own preconceived notions about the risk involved. But mail-in voting has often been a positive experience for millions of Americans. But we do see new, fresh obstacles this year with the attacks on the U.S. Postal Service, which has become a big issue. And we're not really sure how that's going to play out with the pandemic. What is the Postal Service's capacity? And I'll just finish with this point with one note from my reporting. I recently interviewed Jen O'Malley Dillon, who's the campaign manager for Joe Biden. And she told me her key strategy right now with mail-in voting is to make sure people vote as early as possible, because she's worried as the campaign manager for Biden about the pace of service, the pace of counting. So she's telling the Biden supporters to vote as early as possible, which I thought was interesting.
So you mentioned when you speak with voters and they have concerns, can you elaborate on what some of those concerns are?
Well, they're picking up from things they see, like the Scalise interview, or things they read online about instances of fraud and corruption of ballots in certain states, and they seize on that. And so they do. What we're dealing with mail-in voting is part of a larger discussion of erosion in trust in institutions in the United States, and it's happened over a long period of time. President Trump's part of that story, but not the entirety of that story. And so voters have so little faith now in federal institutions, national institutions they associate with the so-called political establishment, that they're deeply suspicious of mail-in voting. And you see it's mostly along party lines, but some Democrats on the more liberal side are wary of the parties in general. But it's mostly a Republican grassroots concern where they don't want to see their vote tampered with. And even when you tell them about the success of mail-in voting nationwide, they still have that suspicion. And so that's going to linger. And it's important to note when we wonder why there's maybe a certain reaction after the election in November, and whether it's from the president on down. I'm trying to prepare myself as a reporter for different kinds of reaction in the electorate because of what I'm seeing out there in my reporting.
So you're preparing yourself as a reporter, but how can you or the media prepare the public for what some have termed a likely, quote, weirdest election night ever, end quote?
The most important thing for the media to do, in my view, is to just report, but report in a vigorous way, to tell the facts of the case as soon as possible, to do it in an articulate and calm manner to protect our integrity, but to make sure that we're not making decisions on the fly. And we may have some delays in terms of counts in certain states because of the pandemic, because of mail-in voting, and the early count on election day may be different than the count once all the votes are in. And usually that's always the case in any election, but this could stretch on for weeks. And we saw in 2000 challenges with Florida, so this is not going to be unprecedented. But the media is going to do our best, I hope, at least the Washington Post and PBS and elsewhere, to make sure voters are fully informed about the count and when accounts are certified. I know at the Washington Post, we often wait for the Associated Press, who we find is a nonpartisan declarer of elections, to help us understand where the count sits. And it's going to be a trying time for the media and our American people generally to have patience amid a pandemic, and patience as people, as the vote is coming in, are trying to sow doubt about the result.
So you're going to stay on, but now we're going to introduce our final guest for this evening, who is an election law expert and a constitutional scholar, Ned Foley. Ned, as director of the election law program at Ohio State University, and someone who has researched and written extensively about close elections in the Electoral College, you have a clear understanding of the myriad paths we might take in determining the next president. Is there anything else you'd like to hear from Bob Costa and his fellow journalists to prepare the public for the potential length of the process and the challenges we face even after the votes are in?
Well, it's great to be with you. Thanks so much for having me and this discussion. And I would like to pick up on the conversation you're just having to emphasize the point that you've already put out there, which is whatever happens on election night, it's preliminary from a law perspective. Official results always occur with the certification, and that's 2 or 3 weeks later. It varies state to state. Usually in the past, we've been able to project, or the AP or the Washington Post, other media have been able to say, based on preliminary returns, it's very likely we're going to know in 2 weeks what the official answer is. The reason why this year may be different is the ratio of in-person voting on election day versus all the mail ballots that we expect that voters have the right to vote. And it's just harder to make a projection if that ratio changes. If there's more mail vote than in-person vote, some of that mail vote just cannot be counted on election day or election night. And that limits the ability to project. So that's what's going to be different. The law is actually the same. But everybody's ballots that are valid will get counted. It's just the inability to have that preliminary assessment on election night that might be different.
And so how do politicians help the public to understand that we may not know who the president is at 11 o'clock p.m. on November 3rd?
Well, I hope that the politicians don't either prematurely declare victory when they're not entitled to, or try to cast aspersions on the process. To go back to an earlier point, I mean, we have legal rules for determining how to count ballots. And every ballot goes through that process. And you should trust that process, including the results that are reached and the tallies of the results, unless there's evidence to distrust. There shouldn't be any distrust of the outcome without evidence. So, and that's what I worry about is, you know, with social media or what have you, you may get attempts to sow doubt when there isn't a valid basis for sowing doubt.
So one question on a lot of people's minds is, what is a rigged election? How do we know if an election outcome is valid?
So by my analysis, an election is valid if the result is the choice that the voters as a group wanted. So if the winner is the choice of the electorate as a whole, that's a valid result. There may be problems along the way. No election is perfect. But if collectively the voters as a whole get the right answer, that's valid. The opposite of that, an invalid result, is that somehow if the count doesn't correspond to what the voters wanted, whether that's by accident, through a breakdown of the process, or through some sort of malevolence, that would be, so a rigged election is where somebody malevolently has prevented the result from being the choice of the voters. We hope that doesn't happen. We hope we get that valid result. And going back to the earlier conversation about foreign interference, unfortunately, there's no doubt about it. That was attempted. And when it happened in 2016, it's happening now. But I think every member of the public, to answer the question, do we have a valid outcome, has to ask, is that attempted interference preventing a valid result? Is it preventing the voters from having the choice that they want?
And can I just bounce in here real quick?
Absolutely.
I would just add that if you step back for a moment and you think about the word rigged, it's a charged political word. And we're in a moment we have not really seen in American politics ever, at least in years or decades, where there's actually rhetoric that's so hot politically in terms of talking about a rigged election that one of the fundamental values of American politics and American democracy is potentially under threat, and that's the peaceful transfer of power. We saw a peaceful transfer of power between Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford when President Nixon decided to resign. We saw a peaceful transfer when President Nixon, Vice President Nixon at the time in 1960, lost a very narrow race to JFK. We saw a peaceful transfer of power, a concession from Vice President Al Gore when the Supreme Court ultimately decided in 2000 on Bush versus Gore. And I could go on with other examples. And so the thing I'm watching as a reporter is President Trump or Vice President Biden, whoever wins, if they call the election rigged, that's a political statement. It's a statement undermining the result, no doubt about it. The question I'm really trying to figure out is, when will rhetoric, if at all, ever be connected to the use of political power? If President Trump is defeated in the election, will he just say it's rigged, or will he actually never concede and on the peaceful transfer of power issue create a standoff that we have not seen in American history? And that's an open question. The president has not been clear in his own public statements about just how far he would go. He keeps saying he has to see the result first, but that's what we're watching. Is this rhetoric, or is this the possibility of a president preparing to use power to prevent the transfer of it?
Yeah, that's interesting. That's critical. So I want to go to kind of a nightmare scenario question. So one nightmare scenario is that there would be mass voter disenfranchisement through malice or inefficiencies. So I want to hear from Bob first and then David about your nightmare scenarios for the November election. Like, what keeps you up at night?
Well, I would just say briefly, I mean, the nightmare scenario is a scenario where the result is unclear due to foreign interference, due to political rhetoric and different political parties not believing the result. It goes back to what I was just saying. I mean, the transfer of power is fundamental to the functioning of the United States. And if for some reason one of the nominees does not accept the result, what's going to happen when the Electoral College gathers? What's going to happen in January with the inauguration? We have not really dealt with this. The Constitution has all the guidelines for how American power is supposed to be transferred. But my colleague at the Washington Post, Phil Rucker, had a great subtitle to his book. He called it The Testing of America. That was the subtitle. And that's where we are right now. The testing of America, the testing of American institutions and norms and laws.
David?
Yeah, I think Bob hit on a number of those sort of nightmare scenarios for me. I think one of the things that I'm interested in sort of seeing is that, having been a former local and state election official myself, is that, I understand even in previous elections that what you put out on election night, right, are preliminary results, and they're not all of the ballots that come in, right? There are often ballots that come in after election day, depending on the state where you live in, either that are because they're provisional ballots, or maybe you allow mail ballots that can be returned after election day if, for example, they're postmarked. And, one of the things that distinguishes previous elections from this one is that in a lot of previous elections, there were enough ballots that came in on election night so that folks could accurately predict the results, even if they didn't have everything. And that is a potential difference this go around. And so one of the things that I think is going to be really important for me as I'm watching this is that we are likely to see scenarios where we don't have all of the election night results. We are then likely to see what is called a canvass process or a validation process after election night, where election officials go and not only potentially receive additional ballots, but validate the results they've already come in. And again, to some of what our previous speakers have said, there could very well be certain changes that occur on election night, right? One example I've dealt with as a local election official is that, right, many cases jurisdictions use machines that are programmed. And they're programmed to be able to catch pretty much, right, any ballot that's marked. But sometimes, in my experience, voters are so creative that they'll mark the ballot in a way that the machine won't pick up. And that might mean on election night that you could have a ballot or two that goes through the machine that isn't counted as cast, but that in the validation process afterwards with your workers, they catch that ballot and explain that this is the discrepancy, we need to count those votes. That's not anything nefarious, but it is part of our process. And I am concerned, right, as someone who follows these issues, that there could be adversaries, in fact, there already are, such as Russia and potentially China, Iran, and others, that look at those kinds of incidents and try and amplify those concerns to suggest that there's something nefarious when there isn't. And so that's just, I think a bit of my concerns in terms of potential nightmares.
So Ned, do you have a different nightmare scenario?
Well, just to amplify on that, I guess my nightmare is that the system actually works. We have a valid result, but people don't trust it. And that's both a public confidence issue because it's our democracy. So if the people think it didn't work, then it's kind of failed. But worse than that, there are ways in the political system and the constitutional process that we're talking about to attempt to repudiate the counting of the votes. There was a move in this regard in Florida in 2000 and all of that controversy because of the hanging chads and it was so close that the Florida legislature said, well, we can't trust the outcome. So we'll go ahead and appoint electors even in disregard the counting of the people's vote. And I would hate for something like that to happen in a circumstance where there was no underlying reason for it. Because the narrative had taken hold that who knows what really happened. How can you trust any of these votes, especially the absentee votes? And so if the political process kind of goes off the rails and doesn't even trust the election, that in a way is my ultimate nightmare.
So let's talk about some what ifs. So, and either of you can chime in on this one. What if we have a close contested election and we don't know who the winner is for a long time? And Ned, you might be particularly relevant for this question because then this brings in the legal process.
So as a matter of federal law, the first date that we really need to think about, believe it or not, is December 8. I know we all want to know the answer on the night of November 3rd, Election Day. But Congress has actually written a law that it's called the safe harbor deadline. And what that means is that if a state comes to a final answer to the counting of its popular vote, Congress promised to accept that as conclusive. So for purposes of Congress and federal law, we don't need an answer in any of the states until December 8. The next date is December 14th. That's the meeting of the Electoral College. Because again, we as citizens vote for the electors, and they're supposed to vote for president according to our wishes in each of the states. But they make that official vote of their own on Monday, December 14th. And the Constitution says it has to be the same day all around the country. So that's really a hard deadline. Every state has to meet that. We may have some uncertainty on election night, even for a week or two, but if we have certainty and closure by December 14, and the hatchets are buried and everybody agrees is the answer, that's the peaceful transition of power that we've been talking about. If we get that by December 14th, from a legal perspective, nothing has gone wrong. Hallelujah. If we still have contestation after December 14, where both sides are still claiming victory, that starts to get worrisome because then the next stage of the process is January 6th, a joint session of Congress to receive the submissions from the states. And we've never had a fight in Congress over a presidential election since 1876. What we've all been talking about 2000 as a benchmark, but that actually ended in December. It didn't go to Congress in terms of a fight. So if we have a fight in Congress, that would be really new in our lifetimes. Now, if you have a fight the morning of January 6th that is resolved by the evening of January 6th, again, from a constitutional perspective, you had adequate closure. Because again, if you get that peaceful transition of power, where you went into that January 6th meeting not knowing the outcome, that happens in Congress. Sometimes you don't know what the votes in Congress are going to be. But if you know the vote after it's taken and everybody said, yep, we have an answer, then we have peaceful transition of power. The really dangerous thing is if the fight continues after January 6th. That's the ultimate, the apocalypse, really, because we cannot have two presidents on January 20th. There's only one commander in chief. And so if the fight still is going on the morning of January 20th, we're in serious trouble.
I would just like to bounce in real quickly. Professor Foley brings up some important points to build some reporting on top of that briefly. Senator Rubio, for example, who I spoke with earlier today, he and a few other Senate Republicans are already thinking through those December dates the professor laid out. And Rubio has actually proposed legislation. It's not going anywhere at the moment, but he has proposed legislation formally to move those December dates into January. And it's something right now that's kind of being shrugged off by my Republican sources in the Senate, but Rubio and his people believe it's sitting on the table there for a reason, because there is worry already inside the United States Senate about whether those December dates will be agreeable to all sides. And could you push it into January and really try to have a compressed period in Congress before the inauguration? It would be very tight, but they're already starting to think through this. This is not some kind of nightmare scenario. This is not some pie in the sky discussion. This is something with active talks right now on Capitol Hill.
And if I can just jump back in real quick, I've been watching that bill, and I'm on record with Professor Pildes from NYU supporting it. We have a piece, op-ed in the Hill publication, where we think that's a great idea. That should be a bipartisan, nonpartisan solution, because it gives the states more time to contain the issues in the state, so you don't get this competing submissions from any one state. It would avert the Hayes-Tillman problem. I think it's a really good idea, so I hope it can get some attention on the Hill.
The Hayes-Tillman, I just talked to the class about them today. So I want to move on to kind of another what if, and it's a discourse that's occurring in the American body politic. So if we have a close election, there is concern that either party could protest, but it's also this kind of hot rhetoric about taking up arms. So on Sunday, there was a top Trump administration official who predicted that, quote, left-wing hit squads were preparing for armed insurrection after the election, end quote. So how do you feel about the ability of conspiracy networks like QAnon and other groups to organize violence or civil unrest in the period after the elections? Is this something we should be worried about, regardless of what the outcome is? Will one side literally take up arms? So I'm going to, Bob, if you can talk to this, and then David and Ned jump in.
The story you're referencing is about a HHS official named Michael Caputo, who made comments in a Facebook Live broadcast about his belief, his personal belief. I don't believe that's founded on any evidence at all, but he started to speculate about an insurrection against President Trump. And this gained attention because Michael Caputo at the moment is the spokesman for HHS, and he is involved deeply in the pandemic response inside the federal government. But I would add, as a reporter who has covered Caputo for years, he's also a longtime New York-based Republican strategist whose who is close friends with Roger Stone, the notorious political advisor, former political advisor to President Trump, who relishes his reputation for political machinations, to say the least. And so Caputo is an example of the kind of person who's around President Trump. And he has already, this has been reported by the Times and others, started to talk to HHS officials about how he may have overstepped in his rhetoric. But this rhetoric is out there, and it's being said by people who have real power inside the federal government. But at this point, I don't see the preparation for that kind of thing in any sort of significant way. But I mean, there is unrest in the country. There is unrest for a variety of issues, economic disparities and inequality, the racial reckoning in this country. Some of it is not related to the election. But I think we have to be careful, at least in the press corps, from hearing those comments and starting to paint the electorate or the country with any kind of brush based on comments by someone who may just be trying to stir up a political group or to gain attention. And it comes back to my core point, which is at this frenzied moment in America, there's going to be a lot of heated rhetoric in the next 49 days. You're going to hear things like what Mr. Caputo said. But what you have to do is process as a citizen, as a reader, as a voter, how real is what you're seeing and hearing. Fact check yourself. Think about what you're hearing. Don't overreact. And I say that's the same way I approach this piece of news about Mr. Caputo. He's a political commentator who now is in the federal government, so it's not something to ignore, but he's one person making this comment. But it comes back to how people are starting to sow doubts about the result.
Thank you. So I've gotten time called on me for this section that I have to move on to CASSIDI Dozier and BRITNEY PLUMLEY, and Dr. McRobbie is joining us back for this section, who are here with some of our audience questions. So CASSIDI, why don't you start first?
So this first question is for Mr. Foley. What controls are there in place for removing a president who does not accept the election results as binding? In other words, what if Biden wins and Trump refuses to leave office?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I'm more worried where both sides are fighting over the outcome claiming victory. And so each side thinks it has a plausible case. I think if Congress as a whole says that Vice President Biden is the new president-elect, I think it becomes untenable for President Trump to stay in office, because the Constitution's definitive. The one thing that is very clear about the Constitution is that the current presidential term ends at noon on January 20th. There's no ambiguity about that. So unless President Trump has won a second term, he has no legal basis for staying in office past noon on January 20th. So if both the Senate agree that that's the outcome and the House of Representatives agree that that's the outcome, that will be a clear answer in our system of government that his term ended, and now it's the time for the new term, which would be President-elect Biden's term. And I would hope that he would exit graciously, but if he doesn't, the legal apparatus would in fact put all the powers of the presidency in the hands of the newly elected President Biden. He would become commander-in-chief. He would be obeyed by all of the military, the Secret Service, the FBI, and ex-President Trump's ability to hold on to office would immediately disappear.
Thank you. Brittany?
Yes, this question is from Wendy, and it's for anyone, but especially for President McRobbie. She wants to know, looking beyond November, what is your prognosis for free and fair elections in this country?
Well, I think my colleagues on this panel have addressed a lot of issues, but I go back to the report, the National Academy's report. The recommendations we made there, I think, are sound for the future. In fact, some of them we described an implementation timeline that was 10 years out. risk limiting audits, for example, are not something that every state has even got remotely in place now, but we think are a major component of ensuring the integrity and the ability to be able to reconfirm a vote if it's close in the future. So things like that, the implementation of them is going to take some time. Ensuring that all voting is done on paper uniformly across the country, ensuring that there's adequate cybersecurity for the critical IT infrastructure that is needed, the voter registration rules and so on and so on. I think as long as progress continues to be made in those areas, I think the public should have a great confidence in the integrity of the system. But one of the reasons we were so adamant about electronic voting being against it is that it's all but impossible to guarantee that some system isn't hackable over and over again. Electronic voting systems have been shown to be hackable, and if you wanted to not have confidence in the result of an election, do it all electronically. And then I think you've got very good reason not to trust that result. Do it on paper, you've got a record, and that record can be revisited and you can reconfirm whatever the result of that election is.
Professor Cosby, can I add a point on top of?
Sure.
I think everything that President McRobbie said is accurate. I want to add one point about the future. I think we began to see a little bit about what it will take, right, for the federal government to be involved. Right, we recognize, due to the threat of foreign security, foreign interference, that we can't expect state and local election officials to be on the front lines against adversaries. Whether it's talking about, protecting the infrastructure like voter registration systems and our voting machines, or even in some respects dealing with the influx of sort of disinformation, right, coming through social media. I think there are a lot of really great ideas that are out there, thanks to reports like the National Academy of Sciences report, the Senate Intelligence Committee report, right, that was done, and a siege of other reports. I think that the big piece will be, will we be willing to make the ongoing investment necessary to ensure that we can implement these things, and do we have the political will to make sure that these things are being implemented nationwide, right? Because that will help determine how quickly some of the changes, as those laid out by President McRobbie, right, happen. Because hopefully, right, sooner is better than later.
So we have time for another question. Cassidy, do you have another question?
Yes, I have another question, and this is for anyone. What are some things that individuals who are concerned about this issue can do to advocate for voting rights and fair elections?
Well, I would just say, one, Cassidy, it's great to have the question, and it's great to be with Furman and the whole community this evening. In terms of involvement, so much was said at the beginning of this program about just one, realizing where you can vote and participate. I mean, many college students I meet across the country are hyper engaged in issues, but somehow, and I don't mean this as a criticism, but many college students are just unaware of where they're actually registered, if they're registered, how to secure an absentee ballot. And for people who are so smart, like those at Furman, I would just take the time that you spend learning about the issues or watching discussions on TV, and take the time to really figure out, before you become an advocate for voting rights, to figure out, can you vote, where can you vote, and make sure you vote. And once you've secured that information and hopefully move forward with voting, I'm not here to suggest how to advocate or where to advocate, but voting rights right now is a key issue, and a lot of it's about access. And you hear that from both Republicans and Democrats who I'm talking to. And part of the thing is, if you can inform yourself about access to voting and where the locations are, how mail-in balloting works, then you can be an informative advocate for the act of voting itself. And whether it's for a party or not, you can help other people understand how to secure ballots. Because one thing I'm really dealing with as a reporter right now is confusion about voting access. People don't know if it's online. Can you vote on Facebook? And so the more you become informed, the better a champion you can be for not only voting rights, but voting in general.
Also, if your health permits, consider being a poll worker. There is going to be a shortage of poll workers this year, because of the COVID. And but we're going to need in-person voting as well as vote by mail. And so college students who are smart and knowledgeable and interested, if you have the time and willingness, you can really do a civic service by being a poll worker this year.
Great suggestion. Brittany, do you have another question?
Yes, we do have one more question. This is from Benjamin, and it's for Mr. Levine or Mr. Costa. And his question is, how can we combat misinformation regarding voting?
Bob, I'll take a first crack at this. I think there are a few things that folks can do to try and combat misinformation. Number one, I think it's really important that trusted sources like state and local election officials and others are proactively sharing accurate, timely information about the elections. That process, otherwise known as pre-bunking, is critical, and it's particularly critical now. Where because of the pandemic, you do have a situation where you could see information about where, when, and how to vote change. And of course, we saw that happen just tonight on this program, where just before we seem to be seeing updates potentially in how South Carolinians will be able to vote in the presidential election. And so I think it's really important that you are identifying and seeking trusted information. I think to a point that Bob raised earlier in the show, which is really important, I think you need to step back when you receive information, particularly politically charged information. You need to be calm, cool, and collected, and you need to think about whether this information is simply there to sort of, fire you up, and whether or not it's something that you can sort of rely on. And I think you have to be able to take time before you immediately click a headline and share it, just to look through and see if this is something that you need to double check before relying upon. I think those are sort of two critical pieces. I want to leave some time for Bob on his end.
No, that's a great point, David. And it's about having that calm approach, hopefully, as a citizen. And we talk a lot about political education, and that's an important part of the political dialogue, to educate your friends or people in your community about your own political views from a partisan perspective, whether you're a Republican, Democrat, Independent, or another party. But at a more fundamental level, civic education is key. And too infrequently, civic education is being discussed among friends, among neighbors, about how to make sure people know about deadlines for voting, about when a primary is being held, about who to call for election information, who's actually counting the votes. Is it the county website instead of looking at Facebook? Not to criticize Facebook, but you want to have places and institutions that are known by the public as trustworthy, perhaps run by the government or a trusted news organization, and help people have civic knowledge. And that's the one thing I just keep encountering, whether it's domestic challenges, disinformation like the QAnon conspiracy, to foreign interference like we discussed earlier. Civic education is the thread that binds us all together at these fraught political moments. And the more you can do to have that civic education yourself and to share it with others, the more you're helping American democracy. And that's to put all the political activity aside, which is so important if you believe in those things. But the civic education is something we can all share in.
Thank you. Thank you, President McRobbie, David Levine, Bob Costa, Ned Foley, and thank you to the Raleigh Institute, Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, and South Carolina ETV. Many of you have asked, how do I vote? There's a slide that's going to pop up on the screen to give you that information. Where can I find out about absentee voting? Here are also two places to look for reliable information: vote.gov, and for those of us in South Carolina, scvotes.org. Thank you, everyone, and we hope to see you next year in person for Straight Talk 2021.